Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Henry Schein Dental Academy webinar series. My name is Adam, Marketing Specialist, and I'll be your moderator. I'd like to welcome back Mark DeTorre as our speaker tonight, as he will share his knowledge on building a fail-safe roadmap for growth. Mark is the Chief Operating Officer for MSG Minnesota and has over 25 years of experience in dental marketing. Last month, Mark shared 4 keys to successfully driving patient demand with us. If you missed that webinar and would like to view it, please email webinars@henryschein.com and we will be happy to send the recording to you. Before we get started today, we have a few reminders. At any point during tonight's webinar, we encourage your participation. Please type any questions you have into the Q&A section of your control panel and we'll answer them live at the end of the presentation. Henry Schein is not offering CE credit for viewing or attending today's presentation, live or on demand. And this webinar is sponsored by Henry Schein's Dental Business Institute, as well as Henry Schein Practice Growth. Mark, I will throw it over to you.
Thank you very much, Adam, and good afternoon to everyone, early evening or good afternoon if you're on the West Coast. I'm happy to be with you again today to talk about building a roadmap for growth. So we'll jump right in. I think everyone knows that the world has changed and continues to change. Our discussion today talks about how the world changes and as dental practices, how we learn to manage that change. And obviously, COVID is one of those issues that we won't talk about tonight, but one of the demographic changes that I think is really important and is a backdrop for our discussion about building a roadmap for growth is to think about the implications in society in terms of the age demographics. And there's 2 key points to take away that lead into how we go about thinking about managing growth. And the first is in the 2019 census, it showed that about 10% of the population moves. And if you think about that from a dental practice perspective, that means about 10% of your patients are leaving you every year, potentially moving farther than, say, 10 miles away from where you're located. But the good news is that maybe 10% are moving into your area. But the transient nature of the population has a big impact in terms of how we think about growth in the practice. So it's an interesting point that we'll carry through the rest of the conversation tonight. The second thing is, and as I'm a baby boomer, I see that it's unfortunate, is that the number of consumers who are aged 24 to 39 now exceeds the number of baby boomers in the population. And that has a significant impact on small businesses, especially dental offices, in terms of that this population group now is rarely without their smartphones. They were raised in the Amazon Prime world of how to operate as consumers. They consume social media and digital technology at paces that exceed any other consumer group. And their dental expectations and their requirements are changing and different than in the past. So as we move forward and we think about how to manage growth for the future, we have to take this into consideration. And we also have to take into consideration what's going on around us in terms of, as a private practice, what's going on around us relative to larger DSOs. We have to think about the implications as we exit COVID and we enter a vaccine era, is the implications that COVID has had on society at large. We have to think about the economy, not only across the country, but within our geographical footprint. And we have to think about all the issues associated with technology. So when you overlay all 5 of those issues together, I think it's safe to say that all of these are adding a new level of stress in our lives. Stress in our lives personally, as well as stress from managing a dental office. And so many practices are asking themselves the question, what is it going to take to grow my practice? And can I actually meet my growth goals, given all the variables and all the changes that have occurred over the last 12 to 18 months? And when you think about that growth curve, and you think about what it takes to actually grow at the pace that you want, you have to ask yourself, are you actually growing at the pace that you want, or do you want to grow faster? And in the thought of growth, there's three primary things that we suggest that you take a step back and ask yourself. And the first is, do you take the time to properly think about where your practice is and where you want to go versus working in your practice on a day-to-day basis? And the second question that you need to ask yourself is, when was the last time that you assessed how you communicate services to your existing or potential patients? And in terms of communication, we'll use the term marketing very broadly, but how do you market your practice? How do you communicate services to existing and potential patients? Have you sat down and thought about and assessed that from a holistic perspective? And then the third thing that you need to ask yourself is, do you have a growth plan with objectives for 2021? Are they written down? Are they tangible? So as you think about how you want to grow and the path that you're on to growth, if the first thing you do is ask these three questions to yourself, it leads you to some of the areas that we're going to talk about. Because our goal for this session is to walk you through the critical aspects that are necessary to build a plan that's both efficient and effective. Now, what we're not going to do is we're not going to talk about the operational plan to get you to growth, the internal aspects of managing the practice. What we are going to talk about is the marketing aspect of building a roadmap for growth for your practice. Now, while both are very important, this session is only oriented towards a marketing plan. And if you think about it, a marketing plan is really a strategic document. It's really designed to help you specifically achieve your business goals. And so it's critical that you build a plan, that you build a roadmap that gets you to where you want to go. So in developing that roadmap or that marketing plan, I would say, in fact, 3 times this week, we've heard from a number of practices that said, I don't need marketing. My practice is growing by word of mouth. And if that's the case, you're in a unique situation. But when you take a look at the overlaying the census information that we talked about and the economic issues that we're faced with in the last 12 months, we would challenge the conventional thinking to say that the greatest danger in turbulence times is not the turbulence itself, but to act on yesterday's logic, to act on the premise that you don't need marketing, that your practice is growing by word of mouth, and that's all that you need to do. And re-ask yourself the question, are you growing at the pace that you want to accomplish your long-term goals? Whatever those long-term goals might be, to add additional assistance into the practice, to sell your practice at some point in time. So are you really growing at the pace to accomplish those goals? And so while we're going to talk about a marketing plan and the key components of a marketing plan and how to build that marketing plan, what we're really talking about is a business process that causes you to assess where you're at today, to go through an assessment process. And after that assessment process, to develop goals and objectives that are tied to that assessment, and then off of the goals and objectives, the tactical plans. And there is no silver bullet. Many people will come to you and say, oh, if you just do this, it's the solution to the problem. Or, if you just build a website, they'll come to your website. If you just improve your SEO, that's the solution to the problem. If you just do pay-per-click advertising, or if you just do a radio ad, the challenge is that there's no silver bullet. It's hard work, and it's an extensive process that you have to challenge yourself and your staff to go through to come up with a plan that makes the most sense for your practice. And so we're going to start with the assessment. A market assessment is a critical foundation to building a marketing plan, because as any business owner, as a practice owner, you have to be aware of the strengths and weaknesses of your practice compared to others in your area. And so as we dive deep into this assessment as the first step to build your roadmap, we're going to talk about 4 critical pieces that you have to think about in that assessment. The very first piece is your value proposition. The second piece is, who is your target audience? Not only new patients, but within your existing patient base. What's your geographical footprint look like demographically? So who is the target? The third piece that's critical in this assessment is competitors. Who are the major competitors in your area and their value proposition versus yours? And then the fourth piece of this assessment, prior to building that plan, is looking at your present activities and the effectiveness of those activities. Those all roll together as a key component for taking you to the next step, which is building a plan to get you where you want to be. So let's first look at the value proposition. Yesterday, we happened to be on a call, and we were talking to a practice, and we asked them, what's your value proposition? And the practice's response was, our value proposition is we treat our patients like they're one of the family. I would argue, folks, that that's not a value proposition. A value proposition requires you to really take a look at what your brand stands for. And a term that's used quite often is, what is your brand DNA? What is the makeup of what your brand stands for? And the components of a good brand DNA is that you understand distinctive differences that you deliver in the marketplace and the desired responses from your patients to those distinct differences. And that helps you come up with a single thought, your single value proposition. So let's take a look at an example. A practice went through an exercise. They happened to be a pediatric practice, and they went through an extensive brand DNA process to help them assess what are their distinct differences. And through the exercise, the practice came up with, well, first of all, the dentist. The dentist that operates the practice is a uniquely different individual that stands out compared to other dentists in the area. Other things were that they specialized in pediatrics, that they were unique and kid-friendly office design. As you can see, all the other items. Staff provides a caring, empathetic environment. There's a reward program for kids. They treat kids with special needs. So those were their distinctive differences. And then the team came up with statements, desired responses from patients that help articulate those distinct differences. And as you go through the exercise, the practice came up with trusted care with a fear not, have fun philosophy. And that's critical. So the brand DNA, the makeup of your value proposition, is a critical first step, because it translates, or it must translate, into everything that you do. Is it translated in how your staff communicates in the office. Is it translated into your digital footprint? Is it translated into how your office looks and feels? So is your value proposition clearly distinct, and is there consistency in that value proposition across everything that you do? So the first in this assessment is thinking about your value proposition. What is it? How is it uniquely different? Or does it need to be cleaned up? The last point that I'd make in this is that your value proposition is not just a logo. It's not just the color scheme on your website. It's a component. That's why it's called a DNA, is because it's the very core of what you build off of in terms of how you differentiate yourself and how you communicate to your existing patients as well as new patients. So that's the first piece. What's your value proposition? The second is, who is your target audience? Who is your patient base? Who do you want to be your patient base? The goal in this section of the assessment is to learn as much about your existing customers and the demographic footprint that you reside in order to match up the value proposition that you deliver with the key target to determine if that can be accomplished in the marketplace. So let's look at some examples of some of the things that's critical to look at in terms of understanding the target audience. The first thing that's important to do is to take a look at your existing patient base. Where are they located? As you can see, and this is redacted examples, here's an example where a majority of the practice's patients reside in one zip code in the geographical footprint. The question then becomes, are there areas to expand outside of the present zip code in terms of thinking about a growth plan? So one is taking a look at your existing patient base. Taking that a step farther, you can see that the next thing that we want to overlay on top of this is, what's the makeup of the people that live in that footprint? So if you look at this example, in the city number 1, where most of the patients reside for this practice, there's a high percentage of children under the age of 9. And sure enough, when you look at the distribution of patient makeup of this practice, its high percentage is children under the age of 9. Not a surprise because of the zip code in which the practice resides in. But if this practice's goal is to grow their clear aligner business or to expand their implant business, the first question that you have to ask yourself is it within the zip code that I'm in now, and is it with my existing patient base, or do I need to expand beyond my existing patient base to accomplish the goals that I'm trying to accomplish? So you have to look at, who are you trying to target, and where do you want to grow your practice, and where's the geographical makeup of those consumers against what your present practice looks like. And the third thing to consider as you're going through this geographical targeting is to think about how far away are each of these individual zip codes from your practice. Because as we know, patients won't travel farther than 8 to 10 miles in most geographical footprints if they're in unless they're in a very rural environment. So you have to take existing patient base, the makeup of the geographical footprint around you, to think about who your target audience is. And then you can overlay on top of that key search terms and behaviors that are going on within each of those zip codes. And you can also, if you want to get very sophisticated, is overlay lifestyle profiles so that you can start to think about, let's go back to, okay, I want to do additional clear aligners in my practice. One underlying fundamental is that the income level of the people in that zip code need to be high enough to do clear aligners. So you can identify, say, City 9 in that zip code. Then you take a look at what's the makeup of people that live in that area. And as you can see, City 9 has a high percentage of people that live or that are aged over 20 years old. And then city number 9 is within 6 miles. So in thinking about this assessment, in working your way to a plan, understanding your present patient base, overlaying the geographical footprint to help you start to develop a thought process on where you go next. The third piece is, who are the competitors in your area? And for many practices, this is a very difficult exercise to go through because they don't want to consider other dentists in the area as competitors. But it's critical to understand the value proposition of the people around you. It's important to assess their digital footprint, to look at their website, to assess what their messaging is, how they deliver that message, their social media, are they doing paid advertising? To look to see, as you develop your value proposition, as you develop the targets for your growth, is it consistent or inconsistent or competitive with what's presently going on in my marketplace today? So we look at our value proposition, we look at the targets within our geographical footprint, we look at competitors, and then we look at the present effectiveness of our activities. If we are digitally oriented, we have to do a digital assessment of our website, of our search engine optimization, of our new patient flow. Are we getting reviews? How are we managing reputation management? What traditional activities are we doing? We have to look at all of those and do a self-assessment on how effective those present activities are. And part of the effectiveness of those programs is understanding how well are we actually tracking the effectiveness of the things that we're doing today. And then look at our present budgets, because after we look at our digital footprint, our new patient flow, how well are we doing with our reputation management, our traditional activities, and look at how effective those are from a tracking standpoint, tied with all the other things, helps us develop the appropriate footprint or the appropriate plan moving forward. So how do we look at present activity effectiveness? The first thing that you have to think about is think about it from an existing patient standpoint. When you look at all of the activities and tools that are available, you have to break each of those apart. So with existing patients, scheduling, how effective is our scheduling in terms of text messaging and emails? Are we doing additional promotional emails? Are we doing a newsletter? Do we have a loyalty program? So looking at all of those existing patient activities and do an assessment of how effective those activities are. The second thing as part of these present activities is external patient activities. A high percentage of practices have websites. The question becomes, are they actually measuring the activity on the site? Are they measuring the effectiveness of the site? The same thing with social media. The same thing with reviews. Oh, yes, we have reviews on Google. Are you measuring the effectiveness of those reviews in terms of its potential impact on new patients, as well as organic search and pay per click or any other items that you're doing to drive additional patients? So you have to take a step back and look at the effectiveness. If you're not tracking the activity on your website from a month-to-month basis, then you're not thinking about a very effective tool in your armamentarium that you're not keeping track of. And so looking at new users to your site or looking at the number of pages that people are viewing on your site is giving you the input to understand how effective those tools are working. Are you tracking new users by source? Who are coming from your organic searches? How many are coming direct? That could be existing patients going to your portal or scheduling online or requesting an appointment form. Are you looking and tracking where these new users are coming from? Are they coming from Facebook? Are they coming from Instagram to give you an understanding of the effectiveness of a very important tool? Are you looking at the age of the new users that come to your site? Are you looking at by city? Are they coming from the surrounding area? These are all critical things that if you take the time to build a website, if you have a value proposition that's important in the marketplace, you have to be looking at the effectiveness of these tools as you start to build a plan, because it helps you define the tools that you want to use moving forward versus the tools that you don't want to use. Have you ever looked at how effective your SEO is? We had a conversation with a practice the other day that is on page 3 of organic search. And when we asked, well, who set up your search engine on your new website? Who's managing it on a regular basis? Are you looking to see how effective? The answers were no. It's another tool that if you're spending money to do it, you have to take a step back and say, how effective is it working? And what am I paying for that effectiveness, so that it helps you assess the tools and the direction that you go in the future. Social media. Who's managing the social media? Are you looking at the posts that you're doing and measuring the effectiveness of each of those posts? Are you looking at the growth of your social media and how activity is occurring from month to month? It's a critical aspect of assessment to help you determine how and what you want to do in the future. New patient flow. For those people that are on tonight, ask yourself, are you effectively tracking new patient flow? Are you looking from month to month the number of new patients? Are you looking by source of referrals, or are they coming in electronically? Do you know if they're coming in electronically? Is your staff trained properly to ask the questions, how did you learn about us? So that you can track back to determine the effectiveness of your new patient programs. If you're looking for new patient flow and you've spent money on Google AdWords, are you tracking effectively to those new patients? And if your goal is to grow your aligner business or to improve or increase the number of implants, are you tracking the new patients by procedure to actually see if anything that you're doing today is effective? Those are critical components that go into deciding on how you build your plan for the future, as well as the internal operations that you need to have in place to measure how effective your plan is working. Which then comes to budget. Have you mapped out everything that you're spending? Are you looking at what your spend is and how effective that spend is? Could you optimize your spend? A couple of weeks ago, we were on a call with a practice and they didn't realize that they were spending for SEO twice. The website company that was managing their website was doing SEO, and they had a secondary provider working on SEO. So they were double spending for SEO. Do you have your budgets broken out so that you can take a step back as part of this assessment process and look at exactly what you're spending, how it's broken out, so that you can think about what are you actually spending and where are there areas that you could reduce spending, as well as areas where you could improve the spend to help be more effective. And the last thing that comes into this assessment process is, are all the tools that you have in place integrated together? Is your website set up properly with all of the analytics to understand the source and the tracking codes of activity that's occurring on the website so that you know when people are coming in, where are they coming in from, what vehicles are working, which vehicles are not working in terms of how it ties. And then is it tied into your practice management software so that you've recorded new patients and where they're coming from so that you can effectively report out? Are you doing an online form, or are you doing direct online booking? Are you reporting out of that to determine what source of the lead, the new patient demand came in? Are you keeping track of it all the way through and out the other side from a reporting standpoint? Are your budgets matched and tied into both internal and external budgets to help you integrate and tie all of this technology together so that you can have one picture of how effective everything is working? And so that's the first step, the assessment. Is your value proposition clean and distinct for what you want? Have you defined the target audience that you're going after in terms of new patient demand? Is it with existing patients? Is it with new patients? So who is my target audience, and does my value proposition tie to that target audience? What's the competitive nature in my area? Have I assessed the competitors? And then have I done a realistic assessment of what I'm doing today, how well it's working, in order to go to the next step, which is setting goals and objectives and tactical plans for that roadmap? So we've got the brand DNA. We have the target audience, the new patient flow, the effectiveness of how things are working, and our present budgets. We've assessed where we're at today. It leads us to the next step, which is how to build that effective plan moving forward. And so that plan needs to be made up of objectives that are tangible and measurable and realistic. And in developing those objectives, it's important that you look back at the assessment. So for example, on point number 4, I want to increase the clear aligner new patients to 3 or 4 cases per month. Well, the very first question would be, are you tracking how many new patients that you have from clear aligners today? Because in order to assess if you're getting 3 or 4 a month, you need to have a clear vision of what you have presently today. If you also want that to be 3 to 4 cases per month, is your existing patient base capable of delivering that based on where you're located and based on the age breakout of your existing patient base? Or do you need to drive new patients? And the question becomes, in what area, what zip code, what part of your footprint would be most effective to drive those new patients? So as you can see in building the objectives, they must tie back to that assessment, because at every point in time in building the objective, it has to tie to an understanding of the assessment in terms of where you're at and where you think you want to go. So here are examples of some objectives. After developing the objectives, you have to develop the tactics that tie to those objectives. And they have to be tied to either existing or new patients. Are those tactics going to be digital or traditional approaches? And then in that tactical plan, there has to be a detailed calendar that outlines all of the coordinated activities and the owners who own those coordinated activities. Because once you start to lay out the tactics, unless you have clearly defined who's responsible, the most common occurrence is the tactics sit and don't get implemented. And so I'm going to give you an example of where the practice wanted to drive new and existing patients around certain procedures. They were focused on digital implementation. There were key procedures that came out of the assessment and their objectives. And then we'll talk about reporting and baseline measurements. So from a holistic perspective, this practice wanted to, number one, improve their value proposition. The look and feel of the website was not what they wanted. So they needed to enhance the website. They also needed to enhance their SEO. They decided that it was critical to do strong social media, but also Facebook ads, as well as Google search text ads. And they felt to grow their aligner business, it was important to do a couple of aligner events. So they came up with the tactics. And so each of these tactics, and these are a truncated version, each of these tactics have very detailed explanations of what is it that we're going to do with each of these tactics. With website improvement, what content needs to be added, what pages need to be changed, who is responsible for what. Tactic number 2, organic search improvements. Are we going to hire an outside firm? Are we going to continue to use the firm that we're using? Social media posts. They decided that they wanted to do 48 different social media posts with specific topics tied to where their growth objectives were, and timing and a calendar of each of those posts. And they simultaneously wanted to do email campaigns to existing patients. So the topics for the social media posts corresponded to the topics on the email campaign so that everything was integrated together. They wanted to do an aligner event. And based on COVID timing, they pushed the aligner events farther into the year. And the last tactic to drive new patients was pay-per-click advertising. They wanted to test the waters in terms of Google and Facebook advertising. And so what was required off of the tactics is a detailed plan, a calendar of each month. What is going to be done? What is the topic that's going to occur in each of the months? When are the Facebook ads going to be placed? When are the social media posts going to be done? All of this needs to be laid out in their plan, along with the key zip codes that they were targeting for the new patient flow. So these items are critical components to that tactical plan. And so as we go through, we do an assessment. Where are we at today? Where are we trying to go? What are the goals and objectives that we're trying to accomplish? And what are the detailed tactical plans that we're going to use to get? So I'll stop there. Adam, if you were collecting questions or if anyone has any questions, we can go back to particular slides that might be pertinent to the questions.
Absolutely. We do have some questions, and we've got about 20 minutes left. So if anyone does have additional questions, feel free to drop them in the chat and Q&A, and we will get to them. The first question that came in is, must I perform an assessment or can I dive right in?
Oh, good question. From our personal perspective, unless you do an assessment of where you're at, what your value proposition is, who are your targets, and what do you want to accomplish, jumping right into a plan causes you to start to implement without thinking through whether you're going to be successful or not. And many times we see practices dabble in marketing and then say, it's not working, it's not effective, and abort on anything altogether. And part of it is because they didn't build the proper plan so that they could assess as they implemented a plan how effective that plan was. So in our personal opinion, you're making a mistake by not doing the assessment and just jumping right into implementing tactics.
All right. The next question that came in is, should I perform an assessment myself, or is outsourcing to a third party a better option?
If you have someone on your staff that's capable of taking time out, that they have an interest and they have the skill set, then it is possible to do an assessment on your own. Our opinion is that you should really hire a third party to do an assessment because they're going to look at it from an objective third party perspective and provide you an assessment that can be much more valuable as a third party than doing it internally yourself.
Are there any tips specifically for marketing a fee-for-service practice? I've heard several times that they're different than insurance-based practices in this regard, but how?
The value proposition. A key component as you build your value proposition, your brand DNA, if you looked at this pediatric practice, insurance not required, it was a critical component, and how they communicated with patients, how they delivered that value proposition, both on their website as they communicated with patients who came in the door, as they did pay-per-click advertising, how they messaged, the support they had in terms of payment, and the critical aspects of whether you had internal financing programs or no insurance accepted is a critical component to your value proposition and the benefit of that value proposition to your patient base. So you have to put it right out in front as a distinct message to your potential patients. And then the other component to that is geographically, are you capable of accomplishing that, and which areas of your footprint make the most sense from a socioeconomic perspective to deliver that value proposition message of fee for service. And so there may be some parts of your geographical footprint that you don't spend as much time in terms of trying to drive new patients versus targeting other areas that are more conducive to have the ability to pay fee for service rather than insurance.
All right, we've got a situation question here. We have a specialty practice that does both endo and perio and implants in the 3 offices that we own. 2 of our offices did 3 million last year. The other office we bought was not as successful. We're trying to grow this for the current $200,000 in annual production and collections to get to $1 million over a few years. We do a lot of direct marketing to general dentists in the area. It's been slow growth in the 2+ years we owned this office. Would like to know what is the best marketing plan to achieve the growth.
Okay, so I would take a step back. So I'm based on this question, I'm assuming that the third practice that you have, the one that's underperforming that you want to improve. My first question is what's that footprint look like? We did a program for a practice a number of years ago, and the practice was totally focused on growing their implant business. And without doing an assessment, they started digital, they started direct advertising to patients in the area, but dentists would be the same thing. And they realized that the geographical footprint could not support the kind of dentistry that they wanted to do. So the first question that I would ask is, within the footprint of that practice and the dentists that circle that practice, what's the dentist makeup and what's the economic situation in that footprint in terms of the demographic makeup? Is that area capable of supporting the kind of growth that you want? And if it's not, the question becomes, do you have to expand the range of dentists that you're reaching out to and communicating with, because the present footprint of that practice can't support it with the dentists that are and the patient base that's made up of those dentists in that area?
All right, we've got another scenario question here. We have tracked our online leads very closely. We outsource our SEO and tracking. We try to contact the potential patients through phone, email, and texting. We have found the majority of online leads not responding to our attempts to contact them. Many times we're trying to contact them within 5 to 1 minutes and 5 to 10 minutes and still no success. Any suggestions?
I have a question. I'll turn the question into a question and then make a statement. The leads that come into your website, the question that I would have is it an online form where the patient is requesting an appointment versus are you doing online booking directly into your schedule? There are many studies that show, and if you go back to our demographic question, and I will use my own children as an example. If they're looking for a dentist, they're going online and they want to schedule directly online, they're not going to pick up their phone and answer the phone when someone calls them to schedule an appointment or to follow up on a lead. So I would take a step back and ask yourself, given the source of the leads and the type of people that could be coming in, are you using a traditional modality to reach back out to close that new patient lead versus something that's more consistent with how their mindset is and how they want to operate?
All right. The next question is, where can we get the handouts that you have referenced?
Adam, that's a good question. I don't know the answer to that question.
Well, if you send them to me, I'll make sure to distribute to the attendees.
Okay.
We stumped you with that one.
Yeah.
Another question: how do you decide which marketing tactics to use specifically?
Oh, it's a very good question. I think it's a combination. There, first of all, is in this assessment of what you presently do and what's working, you have to overlay that to your target audience. If you're trying to drive new patients, and your new patients are for clear aligners, or for your new patients are for just looking for a new dentist, you have to think about your target audience and their most common way that they're going to be searching or the vehicles that they'll use. So what do I mean by that? For example, we had a conversation a couple of days ago with a practice, and they were very excited about the opportunity to do a tactic of radio broadcast advertising. And our question to them was, well, what is the target audience and who are you trying to attract from a new patient standpoint, overlaid against are those the behavioral aspects listening to the radio? Is that the common way that target audience is going to be listening and doing things in their daily life? And so it's critical that it ties back to the target audience and developing tactics that are most consistent with what you believe to be their behaviors and their mindset and their operational MO as a consumer to develop the proper tactics. And that's why, to the previous question, we always recommend that you take that step to do the assessment, because if you don't distinctly decide what target audience you're going after, it's difficult to define the tactics that make the most sense. So clear aligners, younger patients, our recommendation would be digital, because that's the way that consumer audience is operating. If it's a different target audience, then you can use more traditional tactics that tie to how that consumer audience is most effectively communicated with.
All right. And we have a response to your question, to the question about the online forms. They said, my patients do fill out a form and they do have the capability to schedule in our software online.
So they presently have the chance to schedule online, but they're not even scheduling online. So you're generating a lot of interest leads, but not necessarily those that are converting the actual patients. Then the step back from there is taking a look at the messaging and the key messaging that you're using to drive those leads, because for whatever reason, that messaging is potentially driving initial interest, but then when they get to your site, it's not transforming into reality. So is the site designed from a look and a feel, a value proposition that's properly delivering the message? Or is that initial message that's bringing them in, they're not finding an answer to that question quickly enough to convert to an actual scheduled patient?
All right. And this is the last question that I have, and it is, where can I find someone to help me with my assessment?
Well, you can, at the end of this program, you can request a free consultation with one of the practice growth account managers to walk you through how they would go about managing the assessment process for you.
All right. And do you have the website for Henry Schein Practice Growth? I just pulled it up, so I will paste that in the chat here for anyone that's interested. And it looks like we are out of questions. So with that, Mark, thank you for your time. Great content as always. As a thank you for attending tonight, everyone will receive the recording of this webinar via email sometime in the next week. For more Henry Schein webinars, visit henryscheindental.com/webinars for our upcoming schedule. I'd like to thank you all for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you back here soon.